Hey y'all, it's Laura, and I'm back with a quick 6x6 tricks layout for you today using a 6x6 paper bed from Kaisercraft called Crafternoon. This is a part of my March stash kit. If you haven't seen the March stash kit, I did put it together with y'all on camera. I will link that video for you above if you haven't seen it yet and would like to see all the pretty things that I pulled from my stash and smashed together to make my March kit. It is based on an ephemera pack, and then we built it from there. So I have these 6x6 papers, and my plan is to create a circular background, but we're going to do a circular grid of sorts, and this is the easiest way to do it. So you may have seen tutorials on how to make pie shapes out of a circle. Quite often those end up really wonky, a little wild, crazy sizes, but that's not what we're going for here. I wanted to create more of a gridded circle. And so to do this, I have taped together my 4 6x6 papers that I would like to use. You'll notice they're a little bright, a little bold in their color choices, but because I'm using a fairly small circle, I believe my circle is roughly 8.25, 8.5 inches wide. It's not going to fill the entire page, and these papers will have a fairly minimal effect on the layout, but they will give me a place to start. They will give me a base, and when I begin a layout, establishing a base is so important to me. It just makes the rest of the layout just sort of slide in through to the end, because once I have a base, I have a beginning and I have a place to put my photos. And once I know where my photos are going, the rest is gravy. So in this case, I am going to go ahead and trace out that circle. Now, how did I make that circle? That is a chipboard template that I made tracing a large bowl in my house. That is correct. Nothing fancy, no big machines necessary. Just a large bowl that you can place onto a bit of chipboard and trace around the outside. You have yourself a template. So that is one of my lovely tricks in my scrappy room, as I have several of those templates using different sized bowls to help create big circles for my background. Now, I have my circle and I wanted to do a little bit of stitching. I know this isn't quite as quick as my other 6x6 tutorials. However, because I'm only doing back stitching, which is just back, forward, and backward and forward all the way around the circle, it actually did not take very long at all. And I stick to one color of thread, which is white, just add a little bit of texture to the background and define the circle shape a little bit better. Of course, my circle is a little bit wonky just because I didn't trace it completely correctly. This happens, guys. I just refuse to stress about making everything perfect because I would never get any scrapping done. But it's straight enough that I'm able to fit it just inside this punched circle. Now, this punched circle I created in Silhouette when I had a Silhouette machine, and I printed it, I cut it out onto a very heavy, thick cardstock piece of paper, and I use this as a stencil to create circular stitching lines. So something like that is something you can look at. Again, you could just use your round the bowl measurement and then punch your holes in your line there. Could do that as well, but because I have this template, I just go ahead and use that. So I'm just doing a back and forth back stitch with my white thread. I'm only using 3 strands of the original 6 strands. This is just white thread. White floss, I believe it's called, from DMC, and I'm a big fan of how this turns out. I think it adds a nice amount of texture as well as really outlines my circle and gives it a little bit more structure. And I'm a big fan of structure. Linear scrapbooking is my go-to, and so any opportunity that I have to add that structure, to add that base, I'm all in. And so this takes my layout from very simple and basic to next level in my mind anyways. So I'm not going to make you watch the entire stitching because it did take me about 30 minutes to stitch this circle, which is not terrible. If I had done a more complicated stitch, then it probably would have taken closer to an hour, but it's a pretty quick back and forth sort of stitch. So we'll go ahead and move on to the finished piece. So now that I have the entire thing stitched, here we go. Add my circle inside and begin my scrapbooking. So I have these 2 photos. These are of my oldest daughter, and she is painting. Now, This was one of these kits that you could get at Michael's or at Target, and it didn't have very good paints, but it gave you a small canvas and then a smattering of paints that you could paint it with. Now, I was rather impressed with the results she got from this gift because they weren't great quality paints, but she did an excellent job, and it was kind of paint by numbers style, and she had a blast with it. And you know what? Sometimes you gotta give yourself a break and not expect everything to be this great creative endeavor and just have a little bit of fun. And I think that this layout really exemplifies that. So I have these little doily shapes that I cut out from the 6x6 paper pad. One of the papers had these in there, so I cut some of them out. I figured these are kind of fun to create a line behind my photos. Again, this brings attention into my photos. With all these background papers being so different, it would be very easy for the photos to get lost. But I've purposely picked very bright colors to go behind my photos. My photos have a lot of dark colors in them. So that difference helps to draw your eye into the photos where it is different. I'm going to add some Scrap and Happy Studio Thinny Epoxy Flare onto those doilies, just for, again, a little bit of texture and dimension that isn't paper. That just adds a little bit of interest. You don't have to add a ton of dimension onto your layouts to get this. So I have a wood veneer title, and I have these little tiny epoxy circles. These are not going to add a lot of weight or depth to your layout, but they give the impression of it. And really, it's more about that impression than actually putting that on there. You don't have to add a bunch of foam. You don't have to add a bunch of big flares or things that add a lot of weight and depth to your layouts to get the impression of that depth. Now, I did consider adding these two titles up at the top of my layout, and they did look kind of cool, but the more I added to the circular area, the more those felt out of place. They felt like they were adding too much weight to the top of the layout and kind of unbalanced it. So you'll see after a while I do remove the create and the beauty and just stick to today as my title. I did want to get 3 of these little fussy cut butterflies on there that I cut out of my kit papers and decided on today celebrate was the title. Now these kits came from her birthday, and that's why I put the celebrate on there as well. I may go back and add some journaling around the perimeter of the circle, so just outside the stitching in black, and I might just write it on the border there of the square. I'm not really sure yet, but I will add some journaling later on. However, by the time I wanted to get this video out, I did not have time to do that. So I will do that later, and you can see that in the flip through at the end of the month. So here's where I decide, nope, this is just too busy. Unfortunately, it did rip my photo, which is not a big deal because you can always cover it up. Now, if it really bothers you, I hadn't added so much on top of this photo that you couldn't have reprinted it, but I just couldn't be bothered because I could cover it up with a little arrow, little puffy arrow, and it's pretty covered up. You can't hardly see it. Finishing it off with some scattering and splattering. Of course, I used those tiny puffy flowers to scatter around my clusters. And now I'm going to use Nuvo drops and some Heidi Swapp Gold ink spray to splatter around the layout. The controlled splatter with the Nuvo functions a lot like enamel dots. I just prefer to use the Nuvo. And then I'll use the ink spray for a little bit more uncontrolled splattering that helps to fill in some of that white space in the background, as well as add the finishing touch to my clusters. That's it for this one, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, bye y'all.